More than 400 bills targeting transgender people have been introduced nationwide, according to the Equality Federation. And with numbers like that, Republicans might have you thinking that support for this group does not exist. But that is not true. Not at all. In fact, there are a lot of people that do not understand that this is a very, very vulnerable group, and they deserve to have their voices heard and their stories told. So I sat down with folks who are experts on the subject. Dr. Jack Turban, an assistant professor of child and adolescent psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. His research focuses on the mental health of transgender youth, with some of it even getting cited in major court cases. ESPN's Katie Barnes, author of the book Fair Play, How Sports Shape the Gender Debates, and triathlete Chris Mosier, one of the most successful transgender athletes in American history. We had a very important conversation that I am honored to share with you right now. Doctor, one of the biggest issues, there is just so much misinformation on the subject. There's this idea out there that kids are showing up to school on a Monday after getting bullied and saying, oh, it must be my gender. Today I'm going to be a boy, or I'm going to be a girl, or that kids want to change their gender because it'll make them more competitive in sports. Is this happening?
So I think what a lot of people don't understand, particularly for gender-affirming medical interventions, which is what people are concerned about, is that there's a very strict protocol for a doctor to ever consider prescribing those to a young person. So a person would need to identify as transgender for at least 6 months to meet criteria for this diagnosis called gender dysphoria. And then they'd have to undergo a comprehensive mental health evaluation and get consent from their parents and the doctor and fully understand all the risks and benefits of those treatments. So I think there's been this media notion that gender-affirming medical care in particular moves very, very quickly, when the reality is that it's a very slow process. In terms of adopting a new gender identity for sports, I've never seen that happen. We're in California, where we're probably one of the states with the least stigma towards trans youth, but there's still a lot. You know, I have kids who are being barked at, a reference that all LGBT people are furries, and constantly harassed for being trans. So this notion that they would sacrifice so much to be able to win in sports, given all the hostility they would face if they did that, I think it's just not a realistic understanding of how schools operate today.
But one of the issues is a lack of information. So let's say a young boy wakes up and says, I'm a girl. What is the next thing that happens?
Usually not a lot. You might talk to their parents about that. And it's also going to depend on the age of the adolescent. So if it's someone before puberty, then maybe that parent might want to talk to the school or talk to a therapist, so that kid can be in talk therapy to understand what that means, right? So for some very young kids, things are confusing between what are gender roles, what is sex, what is gender, and sitting with a therapist can help them understand that. And it's not infrequent that they realize, oh, I'm a cisgender person who likes dolls. That's not an uncommon thing that happens as kids realize they just don't fit into gender roles. But there are very different kids who really do have a strong disconnect with their sex assigned at birth in a way that feels really important and salient to them. So they may be in therapy for a longer period of time. And then when they start puberty, if they start having really negative mental health impacts from their bodies developing in ways that don't align with who they are, that's when they might start this very long process of potentially working with a therapist, getting on a long wait list for a clinic that could be over a year to start talking about any kind of gender-affirming medical interventions. But it's a very slow, stepwise process.
Chris, a lot of people out there want to be supportive of the trans community, but when it comes to sports, youth sports, they get a little more squeamish and they think, is that one right? Should this be happening? How do you respond to them?
This is really about, is every person able to have their basic dignity and respect just like everybody else? It's not fair for us to consider that we would treat a transgender girl as a girl from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. in her classroom, but then say that she has to be a boy when it comes to sports. So really, at the end of the day, this is about young people having the opportunity to learn all of the incredible benefits that come from playing sports with their friends and having that same opportunities as their peers, regardless of how they identify their gender.
Everyone deserves a chance to express themselves and have their dignity and be included. But role play with me. What do you say to that runner, that weightlifter who devoted herself to that competitive sport and has reached the top of the game and now fears or could be missing out on opportunities or scholarships because they say a trans athlete is stopping them from doing that? Well, it might be 1 in a million and they don't need legislation. What do you say to that young athlete?
Yeah, I'm really happy that you brought up scholarships, because I think this is one of the things that we hear a lot from both athletes and primarily, I would say, from their parents, for parents of young people, is that this opportunity is going to be lost if transgender athletes are able to participate. And the truth is, in mentoring transgender athletes and working with their families over the course of over a decade now, I have never met a young transgender person who has received an athletic scholarship to NCAA sports. This is one of the tactics that has been used to create fear and this sort of divisiveness between cisgender girls and women and the trans community, when in fact these attacks on transgender athletes and the attempts to prevent them from having the same opportunities as their peers is really an attack to all women and girls. There are so many issues within women's and girls' sports that we should be paying attention to, like unequal access to opportunities, unequal pay, lack of media coverage, high rates of sexual assault and misconduct, which is incredibly important right now as state legislatures are trying to pass and have passed bills into law that would allow investigations and inspections of young people's bodies. So what we really need to remember here is that these attacks on the trans community in sports actually impact all women and girls, and we need to be protecting everybody within sports, and particularly young people at this time.
Katie, your book is called Fair Play. Talk to us about fairness, because you're standing on a sideline at a youth sports game right now, and you anecdotally hear over and over, if there's a trans athlete competing, it's not fair.
So when it comes to fairness, I think one of the things that's happening is that we're simultaneously trying to have many different conversations. And so one of the things that I don't think people fully understand is that when we talk about transgender athletes and their desire to participate in sports, we're not just talking about Olympic level athletes. And the legislation that has passed around the country does not make the distinction between elite level athletes and young people. And in fact, a lot of it goes out of its way to be as broad and affect as many athletes and as many young people in general as possible. And so consequently, we have legislation that is affecting kids as young as elementary school, but then also in many of these laws, it's affecting who can participate in collegiate intramural sports, which has nothing to do with who's going to get a scholarship and who's going to win an Olympic medal and who's going to win a sectional championship or a state championship in high school. So when it comes to fairness, I think what's been stripped away from the conversation is stakes. What are the stakes? And then what is the appropriate policy to govern the level of sporting participation that we're talking about? And for the overwhelming majority of people playing school sports, their experience is going to be, K through 12, if they get through high school. Such a small number of athletes that we're talking about who compete at the level that Chris does and has throughout his career. And so fairness is often, I think, a term that is being weaponized to justify broad-based legislation instead of having specific conversations about specific policy differences.
Katie, there's this assumption for male to female athletes, they have the advantage. Is that true?
I think that's a really hard question to answer. If the question is, for those who are assigned male at birth, who go through testosterone-driven puberty, do they receive a certain level of physiological and metabolic advantages that can be applied in sports? In other words, are men typically bigger, faster, stronger on average? The answer to that is yes. But that does not mean that somebody who is assigned male at birth is going to be a better athlete in all circumstances, in perpetuity, than any person who's assigned female at birth. And that's ultimately what we're talking about. When you look at elite athletes, and which I think is the purest distillation of the athletic form. We know that, yes, elite male athletes are faster than elite female athletes, but that does not mean that 7-year-olds cannot play soccer together, all under the same rules and without gender distinctions.
Chris, for these laws being passed, how would one even know if somebody competing is transgender without doing something outrageously invasive?
Well, that's just it, and that's one of the problems with these bills and these laws is that it really subjects all women and girls to increased scrutiny of their bodies and of their gender presentation. And we're seeing this play out across the country and around the world. There was a 9-year-old cisgender girl who was accused of being transgender by a parent in the stands. And we're talking about a middle school track meet and a young person being accused of being trans and therefore being told that they don't belong in that sport just because of their athletic performance or because of their gender presentation. And this is the reason why these bills are harmful to all women and girls. And we need to be paying attention to the way that we are putting these restrictions and policing people's bodies and expression, because you're absolutely right. There should be no circumstance in this country or anywhere in the world where we are allowing adults to inspect young people's bodies or investigate their hormones or chromosomes to determine whether or not they can play school sports with their friends.
Doctor, without you having treated that 9-year-old girl, what does something like that do to a child just trying to play sports?
Yeah, so the one thing that's been difficult lately is that it's not even just the sports conversation, but these kids watch the news, they're on social media, so they hear politicians say things like, you can't play sports with your friends, you're physically dangerous to them. Or you can't use the bathroom that matches your gender identity because you're going to sexually assault someone. Or you can't have your medical care because you're actually just mentally ill and you need to be changed. And this thing about you that you know you can't change is wrong and shameful. So I think it's easy for most of us to understand how that would drive a lot of shame and anxiety and depression for these kids, even separate from the kids who are interested in playing sports, because they're just constantly hearing these messages from powerful people stigmatizing them and telling them that they're dangerous and things about them are wrong. You know, they might know on a conscious level that's not true, but it's really hard to get that out of your mind if you're hearing it all the time. So to me, the issue here that we really should be talking about is how these trans kids are being treated. And we should be wondering, you know, why aren't they even participating in sports? Because we know that they're not dominating sports leagues.